John Sweeney is a British investigative journalist and writer. He worked for the Observer newspaper and BBC's Panorama and Newsnight series. After he ceased working with the BBC, he started reporting on the war in Ukraine. He's producing an excellent daily war diary, which, if you're not already following it, I know most of you are, but if you're not, then I strongly encourage you to sign up to that and to watch it. It has been on Twitter. Hopefully, I'll ask this in a minute. It'll be on Blue Sky as well, for those who have abandoned the Musk platform. He's also produced a fantastic film, which was titled The Eastern Front. Again, if you haven't seen that, I strongly recommend that you do so. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the fantastic speakers that we feature, speakers who are generous enough to share their time and insights with us. And of course, at the end of this video, please add a like. It's incredibly important, especially in the run up to the Christmas period, to keep Ukraine front of mind. Thank you also to everyone who's been helping support the fundraiser that we're running this week to help buy trucks for Ukraine. A link to that will be in the description of the video. And thanks also to those who've helped support the fundraising project to make a documentary film to challenge Russian propaganda, such as Russians at war. We are now at the point where we can initiate phase one of that and start the initial filming. So that is great news on that. John, welcome to the channel.
Hey ho, how are you?
Yes, tired, but we can't complain about being tired because, I'm not at the front. I'm not. There's no missiles hitting me, so I think it's all relative.
Well, you're
Recently,
at a
really.
kind of, I mean, we're all at a kind of front, and there are word bombs and word drones out there and word bots, which can be pretty painful and certainly are very annoying to deal with. But yeah, we're not in a trench in the snow and in the east. We're really not.
It's funny how this goes on, and I'd be interested to hear your point of view on this. When I started doing this, I was fairly thin-skinned, and I'd react to all the trolls and the bots. Now I pretty much just sort of either block them or laugh or mock them, and that doesn't really get me angry because I see that as just it's not having an impact on anybody. It's just pathetic. What annoys me is what Leslie Dubienko has called the Vatnalists, which are those who are on what assume good salaries, living good lives, but who perpetuate Russian narratives and myths, either through being unconscious, useful idiots, or one suspects that some of them are doing it for a form of grift. We may not know exactly what that is. Those are the things that make me angry because these names appear in foreign policy. They appear in big publications, and despite being labeled experts, they peddle complete twaddle that has no basis in reality. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yes, I mean most of the time I ignore bots, in particular people who are just fabulously rude or um or their punctuation and their grammar is bad. And it may be because they're pig ignorant, or it may be because they're actually not native English speakers, but they have, as I like to say, snow on their boots. But yes, every now and then there's somebody who actually sits in the comfortable West, earning a good living, who writes rubbish, and you just go, "Oh, come on, what are you doing this for? Why? What is the point? What is the point?" And there is no proper understanding of history or humanity or the suffering that ordinary and extraordinary Ukrainians are going through right now. Um, and and, um, uh, uh, and there are times when despite myself, despite my thick skin, I do get angry and I do get upset, and I think, oh, for God's sake, you people in Ukraine right now, it's cold out there, it's cold in London, but it's seriously cold in Ukraine. There's snow on the ground, and heating is because the Russians have been attacking the power grid. Then, then power and lights and heat are not a given for a whole chunk of Ukrainians, and and for people to scoff at it and not understand what's going on, I find it appalling.
It is disgraceful. And I'll name some names. Simon Jenkins is one. Samuel Charp is another. Anatol Levin is another. Three absolutely appalling people who are
Is it,
near
is
the top of their professions, unfortunately.
Anatol Levin has just written a piece, I'm right in thinking, which says that for negotiations to succeed, Ukraine should not be involved.
He's precisely the one. But if you look at his oeuvre going back 10 years, it's similar kind of like Russia can never be beaten. Don't fight back against Russia. There's a consistent thread there. This is perhaps one of the worst takes at the worst possible time. It seems to be getting a lot of pushback because it's got a form of neo-imperialism about it, which is layering, unpleasantness, upon disgust. But unfortunately, I don't know if you think this is the case. There are plenty of people, perhaps in Washington, Berlin, who would love to cut Ukraine out of this and for them to go and die quietly. But they understand that that is no longer perhaps acceptable to voice such opinions. He's come out and said what perhaps quite a few of them are thinking.
Yes, well, but they're not in the great scheme of things. They're not very important. I know you're going to ask me about this, but actually, the important actor, perhaps the number one most important actor right now, is Donald Trump and what he's going to do. And I've been tossing and turning about this myself. In that, listen, Jonathan, it's absolutely true that the Obama and Biden legacy for Ukraine has been dismal. That they have not provided, they have been great with rhetoric, but they have not provided Ukraine with the weapons necessary to defeat the Russians. And let's remember that Russia has a population roughly what? I'm bad at maths. Is it two-thirds or three times the size of Ukraine?
It
It's
it
roughly.
is it is. Well, I will go to that in a minute because there's some Garry Kasparov amongst others has started digging into this and thinking, well, hang on a second, maybe their population figures are conflated as well. But we'll come to that in a minute, which could be quite interesting. But yeah, they have more people.
By the way, the Russian population is doing what the ruble is doing. It's tanking, and that's quite funny. But no, there are more Russians than Ukrainians, and therefore, if we don't seriously help the Ukrainians with materiel, the French word for arms and ammunition and drones and guns and tanks and all those things, then slowly, little by little, the Ukrainians will lose. And by the way, that's what's happening now. Um, but it's little by little, and Ukraine is an enormous country. So it's still very possible for Ukraine to keep on fighting for a very, very long time. And therefore the Russians can be engaged at the moment in a sort of Pyrrhic victory. But if America intervenes and tips the scales on Russia's side, that will be a disaster. So it is the anxiety is, and this has been flagged up by people like my friend Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer who wrote the Trump dossier, never meant to be in the public domain, but it was put there. And I believe that what Chris's sources said in that report is more or less true. That Trump is absolutely a classic target for Russian sex compromat. He is a sexaholic in the way that his brother Fred was an alcoholic, and Fred died of alcoholic poisoning. So the question is, have the Russians got something on Trump, which means he's under Putin's thumb? Now, the counter argument, which is being put forward by Trump's defenders, but also by others, including people in Ukraine, who must be uh, who want to look for some good news, and I have some sympathy for wanting to look for some good news. But anyway, let's look at it like this. The Trump's problem is he does not want Ukraine to be his version of Joe Biden's wretched defeat from Afghanistan. So the argument, and this actually fills me with optimism. The argument, or rather, it gives me optimism, doesn't fill me with optimism. But this argument is quite a good one, or rather, is a good one because it would be ruinous for America's prestige and for Trump's presidency if there is a terrible fresh retreat by the Ukrainians. They lose Kharkiv, for example. Now we're talking about something like 5 million more refugees, men, women, and children. Um, Men not of the fighting age, but certainly millions more women and children fleeing from the east and then coming to Europe. Some will end up in the United States, and that will be shaming. And it'll be our fault more than anyone else's because we haven't properly armed Ukraine. The Chinese will be watching. And such a defeat will lead China to muck about more in the South China Sea than it is already doing. And what it is doing there is extremely dangerous because they're creating fake shoals, which become fake islands, which become fake Chinese bases. And then they're saying, well, okay, we own the fish here. We own the land underneath the we own because we built fake islands. We now own the land underneath the sea, and this is to the massive detriment of its neighbours. So, so what? So what the optimists think about Trump is Trump can't let Russia succeed. The problem is that I don't think he's been paying proper attention to this problem, and that his, solution that he can stop the war in 24 hours only it's a nonsense claim because the Ukrainians aren't going to give in that time frame, nor do they have to, because although the Biden administration hasn't given them enough stuff, and Europe and Britain haven't given enough stuff, and we're not in a position to do so, and these are serious problems we've got. Nevertheless, Ukrainians have got enough land, enough territory, enough troops, and enough ammo for the time being to last for many, many months. But if Trump does two things, first of all is, and I don't know this for a fact, but the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency, is pretty strong. It's dropped a little bit in relation to the pound because the pound's doing relatively better, still not as well as
Especially compared to the ruble.
yeah, 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 yeah. The ruble, folks, is tanking. Um, However, of course, the pound was so much stronger before Brexit. And every now and then, when I say let's not go there, no, let's go there. It was an idiotic piece of self-harm by us. But nevertheless, the hryvnia is pretty strong, in particular against the dollar. It stayed the same. Now, I suspect this is because of a kind of a submarine or subterranean, whichever phrase is right, um, propping up exercise by the Western powers. And I would imagine because the Americans have got more money, that they are principally responsible or they are helping the Ukrainian currency maintain its value. An easy cut for Trump to make, and he wants to do cuts, is to snip that. And then you have a big decline in the Ukrainian economy, and that causes a whole series of other disasters that flow from that. Secondly, he can say to the Ukrainians, do a deal with the Russians. And and essentially that is for peace, give up your de facto, if not your de jure, claims to Crimea and the eastern marches, Donetsk and Luhansk. Let me explain the difference between de facto and de jure. I apologize for using a bit of Latin, but I was quite good at it at school. I was extremely bad at everything else. Anyway, so de jure means by law, de facto by fact, pretty much. So what I'm saying is, it would be wrong and foolish, and I don't think it's on the cards for Ukraine to actually properly give up its sovereignty over Crimea and the eastern oblasts or counties, Donetsk and Lugansk, or Luhansk. But it can say de facto, okay, the Russians are there, the Russian army is there. We will live with a ceasefire where the border, the effective border, not the sovereign border, but the effective border is where our army stops and the Russian army starts. And so, but also we want to be able to join NATO so that our security, what we've got left, is secure. And I don't think Trump's going to give that to them.
No, I was about to jump in there because you hear a lot of these said, and I was at a Chatham House event, and I find myself sometimes existing in a parallel reality to lots of people. Not obviously a great position to be in, and post-Brexit as well. But it also seemed that amongst people generally, I would agree with a lot of talk about NATO and security guarantees. It seems to me that NATO is not realistic, is not likely. In fact, a couple of people did voice it. Keir Giles, amongst others, said that this is simply not going to happen. We need to think about realistic other ways in which Ukraine gets its security. If NATO's not happening, then maybe something like Joint Expeditionary Force. If the NATO nuclear umbrella isn't happening, then an extension of French or British nuclear umbrella to Ukraine, plus as soon as that peace is signed, it's not really a peace, it's a contingent peace, of course. You get a coalition of the willing putting boots on the ground across that frontier. Without concrete steps to bolster Ukrainian security, any negotiation surely is just illusory, an utter delusion.
Yes. I was shortlisted for a wonderful Canadian Ukrainian literary award called the Peterson Award, and it happens once every 2 years, and it was for my book, Killer in the Kremlin. I didn't win, but I was shortlisted, and as a shortlistee, I won 5,000 Canadian dollars, which is better than a kick in the teeth.
Excellent
The,
author did win, though.
the,
Yaroslav Trofimov.
Yes, yes. Who was our enemies will vanish. So, but the person who was the fantastic guest speaker was General Ben Hodges, and don't call me Ben, but he's a real gent. Very funny, actually, as generals go. But he was saying it was a big mistake for the Western powers to pull their troops out of Ukraine back in whenever it was December 21. This is before the big war started. And it was a bad signal. So a because why shouldn't, for example, British and French soldiers and American soldiers too be teaching Ukrainian soldiers how to defend themselves in Ukraine? Now, I'm not saying in Donetsk or Luhansk Oblast, and you put them obviously in the west, pretty close to the western border. But you're making a point there. But you should also have them, I think, in Kyiv, in the capital, and you're making the point that NATO's not going to give its shield, its nuclear shield, to extend it to Ukraine. I can't see that happening. However, I do not think that Russia will ever seek to nuke Ukraine for a number of reasons. The first of which is the Chinese really don't want Russia to do that because if it does, it tanks the world economy. Secondly, Russia is winning or stronger militarily than Ukraine. So
Putin
why
believes he is anyway. That's the key thing. Putin seems to believe he's winning.
he is moving the board the military front line, not the military border, but the military front line is moving, unfortunately, in a westerly direction. Ukraine is losing places and it's losing people. Now, it's losing far fewer people, but it's got far fewer people to lose. And because it's a democracy, they care about the loss of lives in a way that Putin, because he's a psychopathic dictator, does not. So that is a big problem. However, um, if we've got boots on the ground, training boots, doesn't matter. It makes it much more difficult for the Russians. I think it rules out nuclear stuff, but I don't think they're going to do that. The other reason is one, China doesn't want it to do so because it'll tank the world economy, and the Chinese will kill Putin if they disobey him on this. Number two is that the wind blows from the west to east some of the time. You nuke Ukraine, you nuke, say, Kherson, then very quickly, Rostov-on-Don, Russia's one of Russia's maybe top 10 biggest cities, will be irradiated. So millions of Russians will be irradiated quite quickly because Ukraine sits next door to Russia. Number three, I actually don't think that the Russian machinery will let Putin do it. I mean, it's not just Putin pushing a button. You have to have a series of minions who also have to push buttons. And actually, weirdly, I don't think Russia is quite there for blowing up the world. I don't think that's going to happen. But if you have boots on the ground, and General Ben Hodges was suggesting this, you have trainers, people, British and French soldiers training Ukrainian soldiers, helping with the medical stuff, helping with logistics, um, not actively killing Russians, but helping stiffen and support the Ukrainian army, then it becomes harder for the Russians to bomb Ukraine willy-nilly because of that consequence. And this is something we can do, which is doable. Now, the problem for the Ukrainians and the problems for Trump's quotes negotiation is that he's asking the Ukrainians to give up a couple of serious cards, their right to, or rather their effective right to Crimea, their effective right to the Eastern Oblast, Donetsk, Luhansk, a chunk of the Dnipro, a chunk of the Kherson, under, below the river, all of that stuff. You're asking the Ukrainians to give up this stuff, and for then the Russians to say that's fine, and then we'll stop. What happens? And this is the Yevgeny Prigozhin question. What happens if Trump breaks his, if Putin breaks his word? Forgive the Freudian slip. So, just to explain to folks, Prigozhin was the kind of gangster chef who actually becomes quite effective as a military commander and gets angry with the Russian Ministry of Defense because it doesn't deliver enough kit and stuff to him and his soldiers and the Wagner army. And eventually he becomes unruly. He gets so angry, he launches a bit of a coup d'etat, and the coup d'etat is stopped. There's some secret negotiation between him and Putin. He stops, and Prigozhin is allowed to live. And then a couple of months later, his plane and everybody on it, his key lieutenants, are blown out of the sky as a fireball. So if I was the Ukrainians, I would ask a simple question: how reliable is the word of the killer in the Kremlin? And the answer is not very.
Not very, not at all, in fact, given all the treaties that have been broken. I think this is the interesting dynamic here because in Trump, you have, and I get that a lot of Ukrainians actually were saying, look, this may be better for them. At least they know where they stand, rather than Biden. In Trump, you have what could be described as a capricious unpredictability. Excuse me. But in Biden, you have calculated timidity, and that wasn't really going to change. I've spoken to people in the Harris camp and the Biden camp, and unfortunately, it seemed that that dynamic was not going to alter radically. So it could well be that this sort of this capriciousness that we're going to see this, and already, we can't really predict what he's going to do. Some of his appointments have been rather interesting. Some are as dire as the worst predictions we could have made. But those who are going to be charged with the negotiation are actually rather interesting. Keith Kellogg and Rubio in particular, no great lovers of the Soviet mindset or indeed communism for that matter. And they recognize, I think, in modern Russia, a lot of the traits of that Soviet mindset, the vertical power, the aggression, and so on that we're seeing sort of playing out. So this may not go entirely as anticipated, but Biden. And I think you've pointed this out as well. If we carried on what was happening over the last 3 years, then it's death by a thousand cuts, an almost inexorable path towards a sort of slow defeat for Ukraine.
Yeah. Um, I don't want to, I'm going to go a bit saucy now. Uh, In some ways, this is about to become the war of Melania's tits. Now, You should put an ad at the front, viewer discretion is advised. But bear with me. On December the 6th, 60 Minutes was whatever it's called in Russian, 60 Minutes. How do you say that?
No,
In
yes,
New,
60 minut, so
yeah,
something like
yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah.
Which is the most watched current affairs show on the most watched channel, Russia One. Do an item, and they do it long, and it is about a 24-year-old porn shoot shot in GQ, where you see the naked body of Melania Trump before she was Melania Trump. Now, why on earth did they do that? This is effectively, basically, the first day Trump's won, and this is because of the time distance and so forth. This is the first day when Moscow TV, Kremlin TV, can reflect on Trump's victory, Trump too, and what they're doing is they're being incredibly rude, and salacious. And what's funny about Donald Trump is that he can fornicate with whoever he wishes to, as we know, Stormy Daniels, etc., etc., etc. But that's one thing. But if you're from Queens, his kind of slightly grubby part of New York where he was brought up, you really, really don't disrespect the wife. That doesn't go with the kind of sub-gangsterese mindset of Trump and his family. And um, and I thought it was a shocking display of one of Putin's tropes, sex compromat. Now remember, back in 1988, um, Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, the president, is a senile alcoholic. He's in serious trouble. This is the back end of his thing. He'd been a brave man at the start. It all gone badly, and his family, the Yeltsin family, were very corrupt. And there was an investigator, Russia's top cop, if you like, prosecutor general, a guy called Skaratov, and he's on the case of the Yeltsin family. Then suddenly a video appears of him in bed with two women prostitutes half his age. And Vladimir Putin, who is then the head of the FSB, secret policeman, actually goes on telly and says, "But the pictures are grainy, video is grainy." He said, "By the way, that is Skaratov." Moving forward in 2016, Mikhail Kasyanov was Putin's first prime minister, and he leaves the Kremlin in 2004, and then he becomes a bigger and bigger critic of his former boss. And by I think it's 2016, he's a serious danger, and he's the former prime minister. Now, there are words about corruption and stuff like this, but essentially, as a serious establishment figure, his criticisms of Putin's increasing authoritarian rule um, um, are dangerous for Putin. And guess what? A video appears of him having sex with his lover. And I've spoken to her and I interviewed her for my book, Killer in the Kremlin. And I just feel very desperately sorry for them as human beings. But Putin likes doing this. So this is sex compromat. And my takeaway from, if you like, the war of Melania's tits is simple, is that this is a signal from the Kremlin to Trump, obey. Because if you don't obey, then we've got more of this stuff. We're not talking about on Melania. We're talking about on you. To do as you're told. And and if I'm Trump, I don't like that. Now, part of the weirdness of this is that Trump's kind of navigates the world, and this is what's so frightening about him becoming president, through the enmities of the people he hates the most. And probably the politician he hates the most in the whole world is Barack Obama. And Barack Obama was pro-Ukraine, and therefore Trump's anti-Ukraine. But actually, the narrative now is that Obama wasn't really pro-Ukraine. He said he was pro-Ukraine, but he wasn't really. So it's possible there is a new line of attack here that Trump will come to understand that neither Obama nor Biden really gave Ukraine what it really needed. And so that he can paint himself as the more true or the truer friend of Ukraine than the Democrat leaders.
And this isn't just spin. If you look at Clinton forcing Ukraine to give up its nuclear deterrent, if you look at Obama essentially blocking any real offensive weaponry, even defensive weapon at that stage wasn't provided. You can definitely make the case that neither of these were friends of Ukraine, no matter what the rhetoric said.
Yeah. Now, I listen. I don't want to overdo this because I don't want to overspin the new spin, and I'm skeptical. And for example, Phillips O'Brien, who's a very, very good, he's really skeptical about this. But you've mentioned a couple of names. Let's have a look at them. The first is Rubio, who's tipped to be the Secretary of State. He is a kind of George Bush kind of neocon in that camp. But actually, coming with that is not wanting the authoritarian powers to succeed. And I'd prefer anybody with half a mind prefer that mindset to the MAGA mindset. So Rubio is good news. The question is, as a top diplomat, how much muscle has you really got compared to somebody like Elon Musk, who is horribly flaky about the killer in the Kremlin? Um, so now, remember, I mean, listen, I've been to Trump Tower. I interviewed Trump a couple, three times, or I met him three times. And I last interviewed him in 2013 about his relationship with a Russian-born gangster called Felix Sater, who ended up helping him with some dodgy deals in New York. And Trump didn't like my questioning. I said to Trump, why didn't you say to this guy, Felix Sater, you're connected with the mafia, you're fired? And Trump walked out on me, but not before I said, why did you buy your concrete from Fat Tony Salerno? Fat Tony was fat, as a great friend of mine, a great journalist called Wayne Barrett said. Now, the thing about Trump Tower, and you get it if you go there, is that Trump likes to have a series of underbosses who are all kind of knifing each other in the back and hating each other. He something sort of dark and pathetic and depressing about Trump liking his underbosses knifing each other. And I think what we're looking at in terms of Trump 1 was like this, and the Trump 2 administration will be the same. So he'll get Rubio as the top diplomat, but also he'll be listening. The other day he called up Zelensky, and Elon Musk joined in the phone call. Like what the hell is going on? So, and that will obviously. I don't think that Rubio is a he. It's good that he's there, but I doubt whether he will have the serious chops in the regime that his title suggests. The second guy is Kellogg. Now, Kellogg is the former American general who was Mike Pence's deputy sorry, national security spokesman. Remember, Pence is the vice president, and as I think LBJ said, the job isn't worth a bucket of warm piss. But Kellogg stood up to Trump a fair bit over the January 6th nonsense, and but the criticisms made of him is he's a bit jellyfish. He's a bit wishy-washy. So that although his rhetoric might be good, the worry is when it comes to the crunch, he won't truly stand up for Ukraine. So I mean, I think the honest, truthful answer to your broad question, what's Trump going to do, is I don't know. Yeah, but also I think the war of Melania's tits, as I keep on referring to it in my rather naughty way, is indicates that the Kremlin don't know what to do either, or they don't know how it's going. and they're worried. The signal of showing Melania's nude photo shoot suggests that the Kremlin um, don't have a strong hold or as strong a if they had a strong hold over Trump, if they were completely confident, they wouldn't have to do that. They just sort of, America rejoices, and so people who listen to your podcast are clever, or watching this aren't stupid, but the Kremlin controls this show, like the Kremlin controls all the media. There's no way the journalists ran this stuff without Putin expressly telling them to do so. So this shows that the Kremlin doesn't know. Once again, the big picture is if Trump allows Russia to win bigly, as Trump would put it, then you're going to see 5 million more refugees, more possibly. I hope and pray that never happens, in Europe and in the States. And it will be embarrassing for American power. And secondly, but for the moment, the problem is the Russians are, they're kind of, they win two goodies, i.e., the Ukrainians give up their rights de facto to the eastern Crimea before the Russians really show their hand on the war. Now, where it becomes grimly fascinating is if Ukraine and they are in trouble and they're losing too many people and they're losing territory, if the Ukrainians, under the gun from the threat of America walking away from supplying ammo, supplying money to keep the war economy going. If the Ukrainians say, okay, for now we accept, we can't join NATO, we we will de facto, by fact, give up for now our claims to Ukraine and the Eastern Oblasts. And then Trump keeps on firing and keeps on marching west.
Putin, yes. I mean, Putin, this is going to be the question here, because there seems to be this almost magical assumption that some form of deal is going to be conducted with Putin. And then it'll be a moment like, 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, 1918. The guns will fall silent in some predictive way, and that's it. Then we all move on with whatever. This is very unlikely. Putin is on a course of aggression, which has been accelerating for 20 years. That aggression has now evolved into hybrid, cyber, grey zone, uh, meddling in all sorts of electoral processes, destabilizing states in the surrounding area. He's just tried to take down Moldova. Romania is in the process of trying to do state capture in Georgia. It is magical thinking to think suddenly that the guns fall silent and aggression ceases. If anything, my prediction is that we will see more and more varied and more intense aggression from Putin. It may not necessarily be confined to Donbass or somewhere, but it's highly implausible that his regime that has been formed in blood, cemented in blood, and now is dependent on spilling further blood, that is suddenly going to magically cease. But there seems to be quite a bit of this magical and delusional and wishful thinking right around the world.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't think it's going to be like 1918. I can't say. Oh, by the way, the guns may stop for a bit, but actually, it's not 1918. It's 1938. You give you give Putin, or is it, or do I mean Hitler, Czechoslovakia? I said, okay, that's the last territorial claim I've got. Thanks very much. And then bang, a year later, I want Poland too. I'm having it. So um I so the question is this is if the Ukrainians do their side of the deal, okay, we accept for now the Russians are sitting in Crimea and the East. Okay. But the quid pro quo is the Russians stop. If they don't stop, carry on, will Trump then arm Ukraine properly? And that is, and I'd like to know the answer to that question. But if I was the British Prime Minister, and let's remind everybody that when I stood as a Liberal Democrat in Sutton Coldfield, I came fourth, but never mind. So I'm clearly not. But if I was, I'd be preparing for a future in which Europe and Britain have to make good the slack created by a Trump exit from Ukraine. So the worst scenario is that Trump, perhaps because they've got very damaging compromise. By the way, this isn't compromat for me on Trump is not him having sex with a 24-year-old woman. It's him not having sex with a 24-year-old woman, him being impotent and being embarrassingly shamed to be so, or him being violent or him being disgusting in some way. The Russians and Vladimir Putin in particular understand compromat. So if people are saying, oh, that's not going to bother Trump, oh, the Russians know their stuff in this
Depends what
stuff.
they've got, isn't it? If it's plain old vanilla kind of stuff, that'll probably enhance his reputation,
Yeah,
but it's unlikely to be that.
exactly, because they understand it. This is an intelligence service, an entire national intelligence service, which has taken over a country. Um, so the interesting question, and it's one we don't know the answer to, is will Trump, through this kind of weird, he navigates the world, with his sextant, if you like, and it's that backward, is what didn't Obama do, etc. What didn't Biden do? I'll do the opposite. Or whatever they did, I'll do the opposite. That kind of thinking. But suddenly he's also now got to consider. I mean, imagine let's that he's the New York gang boss. It's the 30s, and he gets on very well with Al Capone because Al Capone stays in Chicago. And then suddenly Al Capone has been very rude about his wife. And although actually to take over New York, Trump, the gangster, has had a lot of fun monstering the other gang leaders inside New York. He's now gone up a grade, and it's him or Al Capone. And if he buckles, everybody will see that he's buckled, and they'll have consequences.
This is interesting because the Russian economy is tanking, as you said. Putin has been properly whacked in Syria. It seems to me that Putin appears weaker than when Trump was in office the first time round. And Trump is very sensitive to, he may not be academic, as it were, and all the things that we rail against, but I think he's very sensitive to weakness and strength.
Yes. So, two things. The fall of Bashar al-Assad is a great moment for humanity, and it's a bad moment for Vladimir Putin. And what it shows actually is that the Ukrainians, although I've said that they're losing, but they are. It could well be possible that Russia is winning a Pyrrhic victory. So people don't know what the phrase means. He was a Roman, I think he was maybe a Roman or Carthaginian general, I can't remember. But he was a general whose victories were so bloody, he lost so many people, they were really a kind of defeat. And certainly what happened was at the critical moment, there are so few Russian soldiers left in Syria and Russian sailors, they weren't able to properly help defend the Assad regime. It collapsed because they're all in Ukraine fighting the Ukrainians. And that's a beautiful moment. Secondly, it makes Africa's adventures in the Sahel, and these are dangerous and frightening, but there's been about 8 coups d'etats in the Sahel countries, all of the places like Mali, if I'm right, all of these countries, which I've been to, they it makes it far harder for the Russians to resupply these countries because they've lost the ports in Syria, or they're in the process of losing. So but Assad's fall is a disaster for Putin, both in terms of public perception and also in terms of the game of risk he likes to play. Him mucking around in Africa becomes much harder. Him mucking around in the Middle East, he's become a bit of an embarrassment. Secondly, the ruble is tanking, and this has a real world significance in that the tanking of the ruble means it makes it much harder for the Russians to buy stuff on the world market. So, for example, because the ruble is really weak, they're now having to pay a lot more of their treasure to the Chinese to buy drones. And that is a real problem. So rather than Putin being, a man he respects, the danger is that at this critical moment, a new American president could come in and say, okay, Putin, I don't like the way you disrespected my wife. I don't like the way you're you're pretending that you're the big boss and you're being rude about us. I can see what the Chinese are watching. So look at this, son. And then he sets out, the majesty of American power properly, and at the same time rebuilding and refreshing the American war supplies, which they could easily do. So that's the optimistic version.
Mhm. And
The
that's the
pe
last question to end on there, really, is that I think Trump is only dimly becoming aware that he has these levers of power. And they're not just military, as you said there, they're also economic. If the handbrake was to be pulled on, the multiple areas in which the US actually has traction, you could put intense pressure on China. You could drive down the price of oil. You could do any number of things that would utterly screw Putin if you were minded to do them simultaneously.
yeah, so the neurotic anxiety of the Biden administration was they did not want a Ukrainian victory because Ukrainian victory would mean the exit of Putin and then the chaos that would follow from that. And what they feared was that Russia would be in Iraq 2.0. The problem with that is that rather than that happening, what we're now looking at is the possibility of a Russian victory, of Ukraine falling, and then if Ukraine falls or Ukraine is um, uh, cut in half, that's a possibility, by the way. Then the Chinese will muck around in the South China Sea, and the dictators will be on the front foot. So this is it's a real hinge moment in our history that's coming up soon. Uh, and Jonathan, I don't know what's going to happen. Um, I'm I'm going to listen. I'm an optimist. And actually, General Ben Hodges in Toronto at this award do, he said, um, people who sit around a committee who sits down in a room being gloomy, they've never done anything. So the optimistic version is that Trump sees he that to stand up for his own self-image and for the American economy and the American stock market and the things he cares about, he's actually got to stand up for American power and he's got to use it. And he can do all sorts of things well short of it. So the one simple example is it's only since after Trump won, that the Biden administration finally sanctioned Gazprom Bank, which is the main bank which Russia's biggest um, oil and gas company, Gazprom, trades. And suddenly the Russian economy has gone through the floor. It's in dire trouble because of that simple act. And I have to say to my Ukrainian friends who have suffered so much and lost so many of their friends, I'm so sorry that it's taken far too long for the Western democracies, and the most important is the American one, to act in an effective way.
I think I can only echo that and keep repeating these messages, and hopefully Europe will wake up next year. We'll have to touch upon that, I think, in the next one because there's some evidence that that might happen. Maybe Trump might even help that, but that's maybe another whole discussion around the viability of NATO, Europe, rearmament, and these kind of questions. Probably one to save for the new year, I'm guessing.
Yes, yes. In the meantime, um, we can only hope that Ukraine gets it that there are many, many people in the West, in the States too, in Europe and in Britain, across the whole world, who understand that nations should not be allowed to invade other nations and steal their land. And that is why my grandfathers fought in the First World War and my father fought in the Second World War. And all those people lost so many lives and so much blood was spilt to prevent this from ever happening again. And for Trump and the people around him to forget that would be an absolute disgrace. But this is a disgrace which will come upon him in real time if he lets it happen. So I think what is quite possible is that he gets it wrong to begin with, and then as a consequence of his silliness and foolishness and shallow thinking is visited upon him, he course corrects. And
And
the
gets the
good
right
thing,
advisors. And yeah,
yes, and there's enough good advisors around him, and there are some bad ones too as well. Man, we're in for a bumpy ride.
we'll be watching this space. I look forward. I say look forward in those measured terms. It's good to discuss these. It's a shame we have to be discussing this stuff at all. But I look forward to the next time, John. Thank you so much for everything you do there. Please subscribe to John's War Diary. It's incredibly important to hear what he says. He is pretty much mostly right on all of these topics when it comes to Ukraine, Russia. Very important to understand that. And of course, you have a huge network in Ukraine as well. So much better plugged in than some of the geopolitical experts, unfortunately, that get so much traction. For now, though, John, thank you so much. Have a fantastic and relaxing holiday.
Yes, Merry Christmas to you and yours, and Merry holidays. Blah, 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 blah.